And Jodi, just tell us, what's the latest?
Yeah, so Von, what we saw over the weekend is more protests, largely peaceful across the U.S., actually somewhere around the world, but particularly in Atlanta, things got heated after that shooting, and the Wendy's restaurant where the shooting took place became a focal point of that protest, and there was a fire set there. It became quite heated there. The city's police chief resigned just hours after the killing, and the officer was fired. Yet there were crowds there all weekend after that occurred. So that was one place that we really saw a lot of these protests. But again, across much of the country in the U.S., the protests were peaceful.
Jodi, besides Atlanta, what have been some of the other U.S. hotspots for the protests?
Yeah, they really have been spreading, Linda. We've seen many cities and towns even across the U.S. have protests. Hundreds of protesters were in Palmdale, California. They were demanding an investigation into the death of a 24-year-old black man, Robert Fuller, who was found dead Wednesday near City Hall, hanging by a rope from a tree. Authorities said it appeared to be a suicide, but it did raise questions, and there were protesters there. We've seen protests in other big cities and smaller towns. People are all coming together to call for investigations into killings like that happened of George Floyd, and we've seen lots of calls for changes, particularly in how police departments are run and managed. In some cases, calls for the police departments to be disbanded and rebuilt.
And Jodi, we've seen protests go on for weeks now, and all around the world as well. What's the world reaction been from the big world leaders, including the likes of President Trump and British Prime Minister Boris Johnson?
Yeah, we haven't heard much from President Trump, except obviously on Twitter, where he continues to tweet. But we really haven't had him. There have been some talk about that he would give some address to the country as protests have really increased, haven't gone away. But we really haven't heard from the U.S. president. We did hear from British Prime Minister Boris Johnson over the weekend, who denounced hordes of angry white counter-protesters, many of them who had chanted soccer slogans and some giving Nazi salutes. They were clashing Saturday with police in London. Some said they were trying to protect monuments that had been targeted by protesters, including famously the statue of Winston Churchill, who Johnson has described as his own personal hero. We also heard from President Macron in France, who said statues to historical figures would remain untouched. France won't erase any names from its history, though he did say that the country would be uncompromising with racism, anti-Semitism, and discrimination. So we are hearing from some world leaders, but not much from President Trump.